So this is a course about cinematography. I tried to just kind of pack everything that I've learned from the last 10, 15 years into just one document here. You can download this PDF in the link below for free. And it will have even a bit more information on there than I'm showing you in this video. So let's get into it. We're going to cover the fundamentals about capturing images. We're going to cover the technical aspects of making imagery, of making motion picture. And we're going to cover the technique, a lot of techniques here. So let's just start off with the very basic principles of cinematography. It all has to do with human vision, right? We're talking about vision. Motion picture is based on an optical illusion, and that optical illusion is called persistence of vision. So this illusion is where an image remains in our perception even after it's not there anymore. So the most simple way you can think about this, or you can see this happening in real life, is you look at something bright, like the sun. Even just for a second, you close your eyes, you see that image still lingering there, even when your eyes are closed. So that principle holds true for everything that we're looking at. It's usually just on a more subtle level. What is the minimum rate of successive images that makes it appear to be that makes an image appear to be in motion? It's around 12, plus or minus a few frames. But once you see 12 frames, individual images quickly in a row, you can start to perceive it as motion. And the last optical illusion I want to mention is the flicker, what's called the flicker fusion threshold. And this illusion is when a flashing light we perceive it as looking like a solid bright light. So it's flashing so quickly that it just looks like the light is on. And that's the kind of minimum number of flickers or flashes per second is around 50. Once you start getting over that, it appears that the light is just on at a constant rate. So let's get into what filmmaking is all started with here. It's film. How does film work? There's microscopic silver halide crystals that are suspended in gelatin layers of what's called an emulsion. It's just a chemical mixture, multiple layers of different chemicals. And so basically how it works is that when light comes through a lens and hits this film, a chemical reaction occurs. Once you lock in that image with the development, the chemical reaction is finished, and what you have is a negative image, which you can then reverse the process and create positive images with it, which you can project, which nowadays we scan and we use digitally. This was kind of the basis of how image creating got started here. So how did film cameras, or how do they? A lot of us still do use film. How are they captured? How does it actually work? So the film is in a big roll. The image is pulled down, pauses, it's exposed to light, and then it gets pulled down, and again, the next frame is exposed to light. So you can kind of think of it as, you have 24 individual images every second being pulled through this camera system. Now, what's important is this spinning wheel here, which is called a shutter. This blocks the light for half of the time. What's happening when that shutter is going over the image is that's the time that the film gets pulled downwards. So if that shutter wasn't there and the film was just getting pulled down, it would just be a bunch of smeary lines. You can imagine an image getting exposed as you move the film down, the light's hitting it, and it's just dragging along. It's just going to be a blur. So when it comes to projection, we're basically just reversing that process. We're shining a light through the film and through a lens out onto the screen. And again, there's a shutter mechanism to block that film being pulled and then stopped so that, again, it's not smearing the image all over the screen. So what people found in the development was that I'll just go back one slide. They were using a shutter like this, which is a 180-degree shutter. You can see it's a half circle. And the problem with projecting like that was there was so much time spent in darkness in the theater. Each frame was half spent in darkness and then half spent in light. And it created a strobing effect. It was very flickery and very disturbing for the audience. So they started developing new shutters. You can see here one with 2 holes and one with 3 holes, which is now the most common, most standard. And what that does is that increases the rate of flicker. So each frame would be flashed 3 times on screen. And only during one of those dark periods would the film be advanced to the next frame. So what that did is it increased the rate of the flickering over the fusion threshold, so that every second there were essentially 72 flashes happening. So 24 frames a second, which is the standard frame rate for film. Each frame is getting flashed 3 times, so 3 times 24, 72 flashes per second, essentially. So at that rate, the images appeared to just be solid, just on, and that really reduced the disturbance in the theater. So that became that standard there. So let's move now to digital acquisition. Digital images are captured using sensors. And what is a sensor? It's basically an array of light-sensitive diodes or capacitors. And these capacitors, when light enters them, they accumulate an electrical charge. That charge is sampled and stored into digital memory. So it's converted from that analog signal into a digital numerical value, essentially, which corresponds to how much light is gathered. So let's take a look just here at a close-up. This is, again, a microscopic image of a sensor. And you can see there's this color array, which is called a Bayer filter, over the entire sensor, actually. And it's made up of basically tiny little microscopic color filters over the light-sensitive capacitors. And what this does, basically light is made up of 3 primary colors. It's red, green, and blue. When you combine these 3 primary colors of light, it becomes white light. So basically the computer or the camera needs to know what values of red, green, and blue make up 1 pixel. So different ratios of the amount of red, green, and blue create different colors. What the camera will do is use an algorithm to determine what color value to assign a pixel. So each capacitor doesn't directly correspond to 1 pixel. Basically, every 3 capacitors will respond to the color information for 1 pixel. And so there are many different complex algorithms that are used to determine what color the pixels should be coming out of the camera. But this is the basis of the information that the camera's gathering here. And you can see here in this image what the raw data might look like compared to what the camera processing does, using that raw color information to create a color image that we're all familiar with. So how about the shutter on a digital camera? So digital cameras don't need a physical shutter. Basically, how they work is just by making the capacitors sensitive and not sensitive, basically just turning them on and off for those same periods of time, for just brief periods of time, making them sensitive to light and then making them not sensitive to light. All right, let's get a little deeper now that we have just a brief overview, very simple idea of what filmmaking is, what motion picture really is all based on. Let's just get into some of the technical stuff. It's going to get nerdy here. We will get to the cool stuff. We'll get to the artsy stuff in a minute, but this is what it's all based on. It's important to know these things if you're interested in cinematography, if you're interested in creating beautiful images. It's very helpful to know the basis of how to do that, or the physics of why things are the way they are, why things come out looking the way they do. Unless you want to hire a team and let them deal with that and you can stick to the art, I totally respect that too. There are a lot of cinematographers that do that, and that's totally cool. But if you want to know what's underneath the hood, this next section is for you. So let's just go back to frame rates. Frame rates, you can use any frame rate you want, but there are some very common ones that are good to know about. So when we're talking about playback, when we're watching a video back, there are very common frame rates used. Most common are 24 frames per second, 25 frames per second, and 30 frames per second. You'll also see some movies, some videos in 48 frames a second, some in 50, and a lot these days in 60 frames a second that we watch back. So they all have kind of different effects. 24 is the most classic filmic look. 25 is essentially that same look. All the way up to 60, which is, a very smooth, hyper-realistic look. And you can go even further if you really wanted to. 30 frames a second is what we kind of commonly associate with a home video look, or somewhere in between, because a lot of these home video cameras were using that frame rate for a long time. So we've associated certain kind of eras to certain frame rates as well. So that's something to be aware of as well. So let's take a little deeper dive into why these frame rates came about. So going back to 24 frames a second, let's just take it way back to the beginning of motion picture. So I just want to show you this image here. This series of images was captured by Edward Muybridge, who is an English photographer. Basically, he was working for Leland Stanford, who was the governor of California at the time, who was a wealthy guy and wanted to know when a horse is running if all of the feet were in the air or if one foot was on the ground. So Muybridge basically developed a technique to take photos in rapid succession and put them together. So this was kind of the start of motion picture film photography. Movies started to get made after the technology developed. And at that time, they were hand cranking film cameras. So there wasn't necessarily a set speed. It was just done by hand, by feel. And even the projection playing back was also hand cranked. And oftentimes movie theaters, projectionists would crank faster to get through movies quicker and get audiences in and out, make more money. So there wasn't really a set, standard until sound started getting recorded. At first it was recorded separately. And film got to a point where, filmmakers and theaters and producers realized they wanted to sync this sound with the image, which meant they needed to decide on a standard frame rate so that, so the cameras would shoot at the same frame rate, the projectors would play it back at the same frame rate, and everything would be in sync. So a small committee got together of producers and owners of theaters and essentially decided on 24 frames a second as about a good standard, and that's what we stuck with from that point on. So let's move into analog video. If you're a 90s kid like me, then you're very familiar with all these types of connectors that you see here. But basically, analog video is encoding a video signal by using the wavelength, the frequency, and the phase information of a wave, which you can see here on this graph. So it's pretty complex how they did it. It's pretty ingenious also. I'm not going to get into all the technicalities of how they do that or which parts of the waveform they used for different parts of the information of color and et cetera, et cetera. But let's just look quickly here at what standards came because of that. 3 main standards were used across the world. We'll look at 2 of them here, NTSC and PAL. And these are basically standards that are used to encode that color and luminance information. Luminance is light. So light and color information into these signals. So this is where standard definition was born. And this is how, you may have seen these numbers, 29.97 frames per second. Where did that come from? Why not just 30? These frame rates came about due to countries' previous standardization of AC power. So just the outlets in your wall are using alternating current, which is already oscillating at a certain rate. That rate was used by broadcast companies to help synchronize the analog video signals coming into your household. So that is where you see 29.97, which is half of that frequency. The reason it's 29.97 was that these broadcast companies realized that if it was exactly 30, some interference would occur in the image. So they had to pull it back a little bit to avoid that interference. And that's why you see sometimes these frame rates, 29.97, 23.976. These are all kind of coming from this era. They're no longer really relevant because we're not using analog video signals anymore. We don't have to worry about that kind of interference, but they kept their prevalence from this time. And so we look at PAL, we look at Europe, which is using 50 hertz alternating current AC power in their outlets. So that's also where the 25 standard comes from. So let's move on. Let's take a look at sensor sizes, okay, and how these came about. So 2 of the most common sensor sizes you're going to see digitally, especially in cinematography, are Super 35 sensors and what are called full frame sensors. Of course, it goes bigger than that into larger format sensors, and of course, it goes smaller than that. But we're just going to take a quick look at these 2 because they're the most common. And these are directly derived from the film equivalents. So you'll see film when it's shot as stills in a still camera. You see, an old film camera shooting stills. That film is moving horizontally through the camera. 1 frame, the actual image area is 36 by 24. And so that has been mimicked in many digital cameras that were originally designed for photography. And eventually, once these digital cameras started being able to do video, that started the whole revolution of full frame videography, which we're now, so accustomed to. I'm shooting on right now a full frame camera. But we look at Super 35. This came from motion picture film. As we were talking about earlier, it's running vertically through the camera. You see it's the same film strip, just turned on its end. And that's where that size of film comes from. You'll see a lot of digital cameras, cinema-oriented cameras also have that size of sensor to kind of match that look. Obviously, there were already so many lenses developed for these systems beforehand, so it made a lot of sense to create the digital sensors that accommodated these lenses that already existed. So let's move forward. Let's talk about rolling shutter versus global shutter. This is something you'll come across, you'll hear about. So we're looking at a digital sensor. So there are two main methods that camera is using to collect that data and put it into a file. So the first, which is utilizing this concept of a rolling shutter, basically means the data is sampled from top to bottom in a progressive manner. Boom, 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 sampling. And it's taking that data, writing it, taking that data, writing it, taking that data, writing it to the file. This has a lot of advantages because a lot less processing power is needed to do it this way. And you can make cheaper cameras this way. Of course, the negative there is artifacts can be introduced if you're moving the camera very quickly. And you can see by this image here, this is kind of that jello effect you might see in some cameras. This is what might be considered a bad rolling shutter. That's because it's not processing that data quickly enough for it to be invisible. It's creating these artifacts. So there are two remedies to that. One is, you get a camera that can process quicker. And of course, cameras are headed in that direction where they're processing information so quickly, you might not even notice the rolling shutter. But then, of course, there's a global shutter designed camera, which is basically it's sampling the data all at once, it's taking all of the image all at once, putting it right into memory every time, boom, taking the whole frame. It's more expensive, it's more power intensive for the processor, but it avoids the artifacts. So you're going to see this in more professional cameras. The cameras tend to be bigger, they have bigger fans, bigger processor, bigger computers inside of them handling all that data. So let's move forward into how does light become data? How does this really happen? We're just going to take a little bit of a closer look at this. Not going to spend too long here. The light hits the sensor. These capacitors are collecting the photons of light and measuring those electrons. So that analog signal is boosted using an amplifier. This is what you're doing when you're changing the ISO on a camera. You're amplifying that signal. You could say increase the light. It's just taking the light and making it brighter or making the signal more amplified. From there, a computer takes that analog information, those voltages, and converts it into digital values. From there, the camera takes that information and processes it. So it's going to decide what the colors are, basically, decide what the luminance values are. So that's kind of the secret sauce of every camera manufacturer, is going to decide how your image looks from that point. And then it's going to write that to the memory card. You may see, cameras that can shoot RAW. So what does that mean? That means it's skipping that digital image processing step. And sometimes even it's skipping the amplification, that ISO step as well. And it's just taking that very early information and writing that to the memory. So it's going to be way bigger files. But the advantage there is you could decide on these digital image processing aspects later in post-production after you're done shooting. So if you want to change things, do it differently in editing, you can do that. You have more flexibility there. So that's what RAW is all about, skipping some of those steps and just writing that information right to the card or right to your recording medium. So let's take a little look at compression here. We talked previously how that image is getting digitally processed. A big part of that is compression, to get the file size down to a manageable, reasonable amount of data. Because taking that raw image off the sensor is a lot of data. We're going to look into different ways that cameras compress the image, or compress that information, really. Let's take a look at what depth. What is bit depth? Bit depth is basically the number of available color values that a camera can choose between when determining what color value to assign the pixel. These are some of the most common bit depths: 8-bit, 10-bit, 12-bit, 14-bit. You're going to come across these values. This camera can record in 10-bit. This camera can record raw 12-bit, or this camera can only do 8-bit. You're going to hear things like this. What does that mean? Let's take a look at two of the most common: 8-bit, 10-bit. Right now, 10-bit is kind of becoming a baseline standard in almost all video cameras. It's It's a pretty cool time to be a filmmaker. 8-bit means that each channel of light, what is a channel of light? Red, green, or blue. Those 3 channels together combine to create any color. 8-bit basically means that a camera can choose between 256 different colors per channel. Whereas 10-bit, for example, means that the camera can choose between 1,024 different colors per channel. That results in, way more different possibilities of subtle shades of different color values to choose from. What does that mean practically? Where this really kind of comes out, especially you can notice, for example, in this image, is in a sky. A sky might have a very gentle fading, like in this example, from that bright yellow to that deep orange. And it's going to take place, and these changes in these values of color are so subtle. And what happens when that pixel needs to change from that, that light orange to that just a little bit darker orange? If you don't have as much bit depth, it's going to be a more dramatic change. And you can see here in the top, that's what is called banding, when that change happens over to the next color value. When you have more colors to choose from, that band is going to become small. You're going to have smoother gradations, essentially. So that's what you're getting with more bit depth. Cameras can record in different color spaces, what's called color gamut. So that's the range of colors that it's going to be able to choose from. And you can see here 3 very common color spaces used by different cameras: Rec 2020, DCI P3, and Rec 709. So these are different sections or swaths or palettes of color that can be used to determine which values or which colors each pixel gets to be. So obviously, if you have a wider color space, a wider color gamut, you have a bigger selection of colors to choose from. You're only going to notice this if you're projecting on, a super expensive projector, a very expensive monitor that's capable of actually reproducing all of these different color options. So bear that in mind, on YouTube, on the normal iPad or iPhone or PC, Android device, whatever you're looking at, it's probably not necessarily going to have a screen that's going to be able to display all those colors anyway. But there still is an advantage to recording in a wider color space because it gives you more ability to manipulate that image in post before you export, before you make your final image. Let's take a look at chroma subsampling. This is another way to compress your colors. This is a bit more of a crafty way to reduce the color information being recorded to the camera. Each pixel is basically assigned a luminance value, which is just a light value, which is black to white. How bright or dark is the pixel? And it's also assigned a color value from what we talked about previously, from the choices that it has available. Now, what you can do, multiple adjacent pixels can share a color value without the human eye really being able to notice. And what that's called is chroma subsampling. And here's just a little graph of kind of what that looks like. 444 refers to there's no chroma subsampling. Each pixel is going to get its own color value. 422 means you're reducing the amount of color sampling by half. 420, again by half. So you're taking less color information into account, but with all of these methods, you're keeping the same amount of luminance information. You might think that degrades the image a lot, but in reality, when you compare the images against each other, it's pretty hard to tell unless you're really pixel peeping or you're really projecting it on a large image. Where this kind of comes into more importance is when you're doing that kind of fine detailed work, for example, effects work, you're working with green screens, and you need the edges of subjects or objects to be very precise with their color information. When that becomes an issue, you don't want to be doing chroma subsampling. But for general use, this is a great way to save some data. You can see by these two images here, a 422 image next to a 444 image. If you squint, they're going to look pretty much the same. We're really, really zoomed in here on the pixel so you can see kind of right by his elbow there what happens where some of the color information is less accurate. So that's what's going to be happening when you're subsampling. Let's talk about compression to the data itself. There are two main forms of data compression. One is intra-frame and one is inter-frame. So intra-frame means each individual frame is analyzed and compressed. Inter-frame means that individual frames are compared against the neighboring frames to further reduce the data. So if something is staying still in the frame, something over here is moving, this data, these color values essentially aren't changing while these are. So it doesn't have to rewrite this information to every single new frame. It can say, oh, this information is the same as the previous frame. This information is still the same as the previous frame. That's going to save information in your file. This is all basically hidden within the file, that information, and that all comes down to complex algorithms. But this is a method to save information in your file to reduce the file size. What are codecs? It's an encoder and a decoder put together, codec. So it's basically just a piece of hardware or a piece of software that is encoding and decoding the video. So just like we were saying, you're taking this kind of more raw form of data and you're putting it into a code. It's not the full amount of data anymore. It's a way of organizing that data in a different way to reduce the amount of data, but still be able to take that and then unpack it on the other end, and you view it just like it's normal video. You're going to see a lot of these. You probably have already seen all of these. If you're watching this video, you're probably into this kind of stuff. Apple ProRes, H.264, H.265, etc. These are different ways to package the data and unpack it on the other end. Let's move on to objective image quality, how to achieve a high quality image without regards to what you're filming. We're going to get into the art soon. We're going to get into what makes a beautiful image soon and why things look great and why things might not look as good as other things. We're going to get into that, but now we're just going to talk objectively. If you're pointing the camera at the same thing, but we're changing the gear, we're changing the physical attributes of the camera, the lens and stuff, why are some cameras, lenses, sensors better than others? What's going on here? So let's first talk about the sensor. So sensor quality, what makes a sensor high quality or low quality? The first is resolution. So that depends on how many capacitors are on that sensor. The more capacitors, the more photosensitive cells you have in there, the more resolution you're able to get from that sensor. With more resolution comes more detail. The bigger you can make the image when you watch it back without it looking blurry. The second important feature of a sensor is how much dynamic range it can retain. What is dynamic range? That's the ability to capture highlight information and shadow information at the same time. So you might have a band of dark things and light things in your image. How much detail can be present in both of those areas of the image at the same time? And the last thing is the noise performance. That's how noisy is it? How much grain is there? How much artifacts are there naturally just in the image given that sensor's design? All sensors produce noise. They have an inherent background level of noise, but whether it has more or less, that can be a determining factor for what makes a high quality versus a lower quality sensor. So let's just take a quick look at resolution. Generally, 4K is enough. It really depends on the application though. You know, you have to think about where you're gonna be watching this back on. Most modern movie theaters are projecting in 4K. You can imagine how big that image is and how great it looks in a movie theater. That's just 4K, you know what I mean? We don't need, they don't necessarily need an 8K image to look that good. But granted, you're pretty far away from that screen. So that's something to keep in mind, how close you're gonna be to that screen, what kind of resolution you might wanna be gathering. Obviously, IMAX films are an exception to this. They can go way higher in resolution, and you can see that in the effect of how big they make their screens and how amazing they look. But even small, art house theaters might even be projecting in 2K. It still looks great. One of the biggest advantages of recording in higher resolution is it gives you that flexibility in post-production on your computer while you're editing to manipulate the image if you have that extra information with less degradation once you make that final export. So there is obviously an advantage to having a higher resolution image while recording. Let's take a quick look at dynamic range. Generally, depending on what you're going for or what your artistic vision is, generally more is better to have. Here are just two examples of an image on the left here with higher dynamic range, more dynamic range versus the one on the right that has less dynamic range. So you can just see For example, that sensor on the right, it is unable to retain all those details in the highlights, so they get blown out. Means that they're overexposed. There's no information there in those clouds because it's just white. It just hit the maximum that it is, just says, oh, it's white. I can't determine any subtle differences in value there. So generally it's a good thing. It's going to look better when you have more dynamic range. And again, that just comes to the design of the sensor, the technology that it's used, the physical design of how it's made. So that's always advancing. So software also plays a role in achieving high dynamic range. And one way camera manufacturers are doing this is by mapping the luminance values. So taking that raw information from the sensor, taking those values of light and assigning them different values. What we're used to is what would be called a linear gamma curve. So that's taking those light values and assigning them in a way that looks normal to the eye. And you'll see this image on the left here. That's just kind of a normal contrasty looking image. But what you can do is you can map those same raw luminance values of those pixels over a logarithmic curve. What that's doing is it's adding a lot more information into the shadows and into the highlights of the image, and it's flattening out all the stuff in the middle. That image that comes out is a lot flatter. It's a lot more washed out. It's a lot less contrast. But what it does is it's giving you way more variance of information in the shadows and in the highlights, so that later when you take that file, you take that information back into the computer on the other end, you can stretch it back out and manipulate it to appear again to be a normal contrasty looking image. But the advantage there is that you have more information in those shadows and in those highlights that would have not gotten written to the data if you recorded it using a linear gamma curve. All right, let's take a look at noise performance. Sensors have kind of an optimal setting that the sensor manufacturer designed the sensor to be used at, where it's going to produce the least amount of noise, or at least the amount of noise that they felt like was the right amount for that sensor. So that's what we might call a base ISO. Some sensor manufacturers have designed sensors that have two very optimal settings, and I'm sure we're going to see more in the future as this technology continues to develop. But as you add more amplification to the sensor in the form of turning up your ISO, you're going to see more and more noise. And the way that sensor handles that is different depending on the design of the sensor. And so each sensor is going to have its own character to that noise, how it looks, how it feels, how it's moving, how it's dancing, or how distracting, how annoying, or how kind of crunchy and gross it makes the image look. So that's something, could be an artistic thing to consider, or, or something to avoid entirely if you want a super clean image. Lens quality, objectively, can be determined by a bunch of different characteristics. First, most basic thing is sharpness. So that's the ability for a lens to render fine details of the image. Basically, that it's not out of focus, Another qualification would be lack of distortion. How much distortion does the lens have? Is it bulging or pushing in different ways? And as we'll look at later, sometimes it's actually nice to have a little bit of distortion. Sometimes it can look natural, or it can be a desired thing to have a little bit of that. The lack of chroma or vignetting, that's how much the edges of the lens are darker than the center or more bright than the center. The color rendering of the lens is another determining factor of lens quality. And finally, lack of chromatic aberration. Chromatic aberration is something that we see in many, many lenses, which are basically color fringing around the edges of objects. You'll see it especially in branches of trees, things like that. The bokeh rendering. What is bokeh? Bokeh is essentially the quality or the characteristic of the out of focus areas of an image. And this is pretty subjective. What is good bokeh? What is not good bokeh? That's up to you to decide. But it's just something to think about when picking a lens. So you see here some examples of different styles or different looking bokeh depending on the lens. Micro contrast, this is a little bit airy-fairy term. It's maybe getting into a little bit of perfectionist land. But essentially, the idea of what micro contrast is the ability of a lens to be able to render in a small area of the image a strong tonal variation relative to the adjacent areas of that area of the image. So we can just look at these two images of this eye here. The one on the left would have high micro contrast. The one on the right would have lower micro contrast. And you can see that in the eyelashes very clearly, actually, where we're looking at a very small part of the image, how this lens on the left is able to still separate from one eyelash right next to it to the skin. It's a sharp line. It's different than sharpness. Both of these images, the eyeball you can see is fully in focus. It is sharp, and yet those lines of the eyelash are clearly distinguishable from the skin right next to it, whereas the one on the right, it's a bit of a mush. There's a bit of a softness to it. So that's essentially what micro contrast is. We're getting a little bit nitpicky here. Character of a lens. What is character? Character is just the combination of the design of the lens, the craftsmanship of the lens, the materials that a lens uses, the type of glass, the coatings on the glass, and of course, kind of the combination of the flaws, you could say, flaws of the lens that create an image, that create a characteristic type of image. That is going to be something that you're going to have to decide what kind of lenses you like. I recommend testing lenses as much as you can and get a sense for what's out there and see what you genuinely like, you know. And we have primes versus zooms. Primes are lenses that don't zoom. They just have one fixed focal length. Those types of lenses tend to have a superior optical performance. They tend to have wider maximum apertures. That means they tend to be able to let in more light, and they tend to be smaller and lighter weight. The opposite is true for the zooms. They tend to have diminished optical performance when compared to a prime. They tend to have slower maximum apertures. They tend to not be able to let in as much light, and they tend to be bigger and heavier. But they also present new creative opportunities for the filmmaker versus the prime. Obviously, you can zoom on them, which can be really useful for certain effects, or if you're in a documentary situation, you need to switch lenses more quickly, or rather need to switch focal lengths more quickly. And lastly, here we're going to look at the difference between spherical lenses and anamorphic lenses. What are these two types of lenses? Spherical lenses basically project a circular image out of the back of the lens. If you just take a lens, hold it up to the light, put a piece of paper behind it, it's going to create a circle. And that's what, where your sensor is going to be. So they project a circular image. Whereas anamorphic lenses, they have an element which squeezes the image horizontally onto the sensor. That is done with the intention to de-squeeze that image later in post-production. Why did these lenses come about? They came about when we were still shooting on film, and you can see these images on the right. With the anamorphic lens, you could squeeze more horizontal data into that image and later, again, de-squeeze it back. So you're using a taller slice of the film to pack that same width of information in. What the advantage there is higher resolution. Whereas you can see above, that film strip is using a spherical image. It's still widescreen, but you're cropping down. You're using less height on that piece of film. Therefore, you're using less resolution. So that's why anamorphic was invented, was to get more resolution out of each piece or each frame of film. And we still use those lenses today in digital filmmaking because a lot of us like the look of them, and it reminds us of big movies. So what's the difference of the look? So with spherical lenses, generally you're getting faster apertures, which is an advantage. You can they can let more light in. They generally have lower distortion, and they generally have a circular rendering of the bokeh. Anamorphic lenses, however, they generally have slower apertures. They generally have more distortion. They're generally also bigger and heavier. And they generally have an oval rendering for the bokeh, that out of focus background area. And they can also introduce interesting lens flares. And it's those last two aspects to anamorphic lenses that really give them a special characteristic. As you can see in these sample images with the woman, if you notice the trees behind her in the spherical lenses versus the anamorphic, you can see that effect of that oval bokeh there in the anamorphic, and how that kind of gives a certain nuance to the image that we may associate with a filmic quality, because we've seen a lot of big movies that have been shot on that in the past, probably. But it looks great. All right. Finally, we've made it to the art and technique phase of this presentation. Let's talk a little bit about location, set design, and wardrobe. I tell this to a lot of people when they're asking me how to get a good image from the camera. I always tell them that it's what you're pointing the camera at that makes the biggest difference. It plays the greatest role in creating a compelling image more than anything else, more than the camera you own or the lens you put on it. All that stuff matters, but what you're looking at is the key thing. So let's just talk about a couple tips to, pretty obvious tips to make a compelling image here. Search for great locations to serve as a backdrop for your story or what you're trying to tell. Here's an image from Lord of the Rings. I mean, in this photo, we can see just the location, the backdrop, the hills, this gorgeous location. So, you could just find amazing locations that serve your story. So, along that line, use spaces that have an interesting design already existing, interesting architecture, interesting furniture that might already exist in spaces. Or you can create those spaces if you have the time and the budget. You can change fabrics, you can introduce furniture, you can remove things from the set to create an environment that serves the story. You can use natural lighting to your advantage. So I always recommend, if there's time, to analyze the way that the light looks in a space that you're planning on shooting in at different times of day, so you can see what kind of, how it looks and when it looks best. And lastly here, utilize the actor's wardrobe. How that will look against certain backgrounds, what kind of fabrics and textures, how it might stand out against different backgrounds or in different types of lighting. All right, so let's just take a look at what assets you have available to you as a cinematographer. And again, I just love to stress that equipment is perhaps the least important asset that you have available to you, but obviously it is still critical. So the first thing is quite straightforward. It's the script and the story. That's your Bible of the movie. That's going to be the main tool that you have to tell the story. So then we have the talent, your actors, which are going to be the main thing that the audience is going to be looking at for most of the time on the film. So just something important to keep in mind is the shape of their face, how they look under different lighting conditions. And then you have your director, obviously. They're going to bring a lot to the table, hopefully. You can ask them to give you some references for what they're looking for. And then you have your crew, which again is another huge knowledge base, hopefully. And then, of course, equipment and then post-production facilities, what you have at your disposal, who your editors are, who your colorists are, what kind of tools they're working with. These are some choices that you get to make as a cinematographer that affect the way that the image looks. The first is the format. So are you shooting on film? Are you shooting on analog video? Or are you shooting digital? You have different sensor sizes and other things like that, different types of tape, different types of film. All these things give a different look. And then you have the camera. So just some things to consider, of course, image quality and ergonomics. So the size and the weight, the layout, where the controls are placed, how it feels in your hand, how easily you're able to manage it. That's going to help you get great looking handheld footage, for example, if you know how to use it, if you're comfortable with it, if it feels good on your body. Also, what available features the camera has. Does it have things like in-body stabilization or autofocus, or what kind of frame rates you might have access to? All these kind of things, all these different features, they may or may not be important for your story, but that's something to be aware of course. Let's get into framing and composition. We can look at it just like hanging a picture frame over reality. Okay, an image has 4 sides, and we're determining where to put those edges of the frame. What is framing? It's basically how much of an image do you want to show in relation to the scene, to the context, to the environment, to reality. And here's some just kind of classic conventional labels for different types of framing, which you will hear commonly if you're in this industry. The establishing shot, so that's just a wide view of the environment or the setting. A wide shot, the subjects are positioned far away from the camera to show their scale in relation to the environment. A full shot, that would be the character's body, is in the shot, their full body. A medium wide shot, that's a waist up shot essentially. And you got a medium shot, that's about belly button up. Perhaps this is the most normal or the most common feeling. Look, we're in a medium shot right now. Medium close up, that's chest up. That prioritizes the character's emotionality, but still leaves a bit of context. You can kind of still see what's going on. And then we got a close up, which is essentially neck up. Obviously more dramatic, more intimate. And then you have the extreme close up, which is isolating a certain area of the face, typically the eyes. Okay, then we have aspect ratio. So this is what is the shape of your frame, essentially. You can have wider frames, you can have taller frames, you can have more square frames. So, I've laid out here some of the most common ones, perhaps the 3 most common ones. You have 1:3:7:1, which is what you'll see in a lot of older movies. You have 1:8:5:1, which is very, very common format. It's very similar to 16:9. And then you have 2:3:5:1, very common widescreen aspect ratio. And they all give you a little bit of a different feel. I think the wider you go, kind of the more epic in a way, the film can feel, especially if you're watching in a big movie theater, for example. Having that large widescreen gives a feeling of vastness, of some kind of epic nature to it, whereas a format like 1:8:5:1, for example, gives the actors a little bit more room, a little bit more priority. So you'll see this commonly used in comedies, dramas, and stories like that. Okay, let's take a look at compositional elements and concepts. So what are we doing here? We're painting with light, we're painting with pixels. And I like to look at the elements of design as a place to start for jogging the memory, or rather inspiring, that creative right brain to come up with what to do with your image, how to construct it, what to point the camera at to make it look interesting. So let's look at some of these compositional elements. So points. Perhaps the most basic. A point is just an object or a subject that is separated by contrast or color or texture from the rest of the frame. So you'll see that golf ball is a point, and it is easy to see against that green grass. So your eye's drawn to it. Lines, vertical lines and horizontal lines, for example. Vertical lines can suggest height and strength. Horizontal lines can suggest a peaceful and calm vibe, just like, horizons, that sense of infinity. Diagonal lines, they can give a sense of unsettledness. I love this example from The Matrix here, where Neo's talking on the phone, and behind him are slats of wood at a relatively sharp angle there, and it helps to give that feeling of intensity to that scene. Curved lines can give a sense of grace or that sense of flow. It can be a kind of a calm vibe. Leading lines are basically using lines that lead the eye to a focal point. So this image down here, for example, is a great example of that. We can see how all this, the line of the light and the shadow, the lines along the end of that hallway there at the airport are leading to this character's face. Shapes. So shapes can be used to cut the frame or to simplify the frame, to create frames within the frame, or basically a different shape of a frame, for example. They can even create the idea of a threat, which is, by creating the desire to see more, by not showing the full image. Textures and patterns. They can also be used to separate subjects from the scene or merge them into the scene. Space and tone, another way to separate subjects from the scene or merge them. And that's just using brightness or contrast or hue to separate subjects from the background. So depth can be used to create more visual interest in your image or to reveal action on different levels of an image. For example, this woman here in the glass, you can also see there's even a plane in front of her with some more out of focus things. We're looking through glass at her in the middle. So it's, really working on those three levels, foreground, midground, and background, to put elements on all of those levels can contribute to creating a more compelling image. We can see an example of some deep depth of field here of the man, of the homeless dude down here on the street. We can see everything going on in the background. It's very wide, and it really puts him in the context of the environment of everyone moving around him. Let's move on. Balance. So just using symmetry or lack thereof can create a sense of a world in or out of balance. Let's look at color. Color's pretty obvious, Color schemes can create an emotional palette for the film, so that's something you can figure out early on, which colors you want to prioritize in your film, what they might symbolize to an actor, to a character, or otherwise. They can also be used to separate subjects again from the scene, or to lead the eye to a particular part of the image. They can also be used as a tool to illustrate a theme in general. So, again, I love looking at the Matrix as an example. The woman in the red dress, obviously your eye's drawn there. Basically, the rest of the frame is black, white, and green, so she really stands out. And that's obviously on purpose. That's literally part of the story. Where is your eye going? It's drawn to the woman in the red dress. But we can also look at the Matrix again, how they use, just the whole tonality of green light and green tones to represent the world inside of the Matrix. So relative size of objects can also influence the viewer to perceive things as more or less important depending on their size. It's also just it can be a fun compositional tool as well. So let's talk a little bit about composing a frame. We talked about how to separate the elements on screen, how to make things stand out, and how to draw the eye to different areas of the frame. But how do we decide where to place these elements within the frame itself? What looks good? Why do we choose to put things in certain places? So there are two essential questions here. One, how much of a subject should I show in relation to the environment? So shots with subjects that are positioned far away from the camera reveal a character's scale in relation to the environment. You can see the top image here. Small people, a lot of the environment. Shots with subjects shown close up to the camera, they prioritize a character's emotionality and can feel dramatic and intimate. There's the image on the bottom. You can see his expression. Pretty obvious, right? Second essential question, how much of a subject should I show in relation to other subjects? So shots with subjects that are alone in the frame, they can give a sense of isolation or introspection. They can be used this way, for example. Not that it's just always going to be that way. Shots of a character that include parts of another character's body link them psychologically, feel like they're more in a conversation together. So simple stuff, but interesting to note. Let's talk about some of the conventional names for how much of a subject to show in relation to other subjects. So we have a single, which features just one character alone in the frame. A clean single means that no other part of any other character is visible in the frame. That's just, so clean single is just one character, that's it. A dirty single, that would mean it includes a limited part of another character. That's what we were just looking at before. We see a little bit of the shoulder of the other guy in the frame. It links the character psychologically. Then we have a two shot, means two characters are visible in the frame with both faces clearly visible. You can go on, 3 shot, 4 shot, etc. We have a master shot, which is a wider shot generally that includes all or the majority of the characters in a given scene. You have your over the shoulder shot, which we were also looking at before. It's a classic. We have a point of view shot, which is the camera is acting as if they were the eyes of the character. And then you have an insert shot. It tends to be a close up, tends to be a short length amount of time of a shot, but just to show a detail of something that perhaps the actor is interacting with, for example, or any detail, usually used to convey information. So like an actor setting the alarm clock to a specific time, the insert would be the alarm clock set at 5:59 a.m., for example. So let's look at some conventions in composition that have been used for, I don't know how long, but they've been around for seemingly the whole time. Quote unquote rule of thirds. It's a way to divide a frame in order to determine where to place focal points or points of interest or characters within the frame. So there you go. You can clearly see in these two images, they're using the rule of thirds here to figure out how to frame the image. Golden triangle is another interesting way to divide a frame in order to determine where to place those focal points. So you can see a couple more frames that are using golden triangle to place characters. Golden ratio. It's used quite a lot, actually, once you start checking it out. Another interesting convention for where to place focal points. The rule of fifths. This one is a little bit more nuanced. It tends to be used more with films that are in that 2:3:9 or that 2:3:5:1 aspect ratio, a wider aspect ratio. Center framing. That's what we're doing right now. That's what you're going to see on YouTube a lot, for sure. And it's used all over the place all the time. It really just highlights a character's importance, puts them in the middle of the frame. Simple. Looks great. Hard side framing. So this is putting a subject far to one side of the frame, all the way on the edge, and it can really give a sense that something is out of balance or something's not right. Headroom is another interesting and useful concept to know about. So that's how much negative space there is above somebody's head. So you can put them really low in the frame and it might feel a little funky and weird. You can have them kind of balanced or near the top, which is what we got going on right now. It's going to feel quite normal, or like this image on the right. And obviously you can have too little headroom. If all of a sudden part of your head's out of the frame, that's probably just going to feel amateurish in general, unless you're doing it for a specific reason. Then go for it, make some art. Lead room or looking room. That's how much negative space is to the side of the character in the direction that they're looking. So we can see the image on the left here. There's a generous amount of lead or looking room, and that's kind of just gives a normal vibe for the most part. And you can see the image on the right from the TV show Mr. Robot, where they have almost no lead room at all. And they were really fond of doing this a lot in their composing of shots. And it really gives a sense of nervousness and uneasiness because you really can't see what he's looking at, and it makes him feel a little bit more trapped and contained within his environment. Another concept is relative position of the characters. So you can have the characters on opposite sides of the frame, or you can have them very close to each other in the frame. So how much space is in between them within the frame itself? When they're far away from each other, like this top image, they're on opposing sides, it can really make the characters feel like they're more distant from each other. Or like the image on the bottom, the characters are very close, and obviously also they're like, they have an intimate vibe going on. But still, even if you're doing an interview setup, for example, to have the subjects closer together, you don't even have to have their seats closer together, but just by pulling the camera back and adding more space on the sides of the frame will give the impression that they have more of a connection. Obviously, there are other factors involved, but it's a tool that you can use. The 180-degree rule. So this is a pretty important one to know if you want to make shots that work together in an edit, especially when characters are talking to each other. So this is basically the concept that when two characters are speaking with each other, you can draw an imaginary line between them. And the concept is that the camera should stay on one side of that line while they're having the conversation. So when you're cutting back and forth from different angles, it will feel like they're really talking to each other. One character will be looking one direction in the frame, the other character will be looking in the other direction. If you cross that line and you're cutting back and forth, the characters will be looking in the same direction. It will be confusing. It won't edit well together, and you'll figure this out pretty quickly when you try it on your own. Of course, you could break that rule on purpose to create a sense of unease or discomfort. Another thing you can do is cross the line mid-scene on purpose. You could change. You could do one half of a scene on one side, one half on the other. Let's say there's a big change in the emotional character, flavor of the conversation. You want to change that at that moment, for example. There are ways you can get across the line. One is you move the camera physically across during the shot, and you would use that in your edit and then continue on the other side. Or you could have any shot that's right on the line. It could be a close-up, even somebody looking directly into the lens, and then you could switch. Or generally just get a wide shot from somewhere so you can understand the context, and then you can switch, and that can work too. Let's talk a little bit about the psychology of camera angles. Angles of the camera can really play into the perception an audience might feel towards somebody that they're watching on screen. The first and most obvious angle is no angle. It's just straight on, perpendicular to the scene. You can see here on the right of this image, the bookshelf, the line is perfectly straight. So the camera's straight on. It's not tilted up. It's not tilted down. It's right at the height of the actor's faces there. And it just feels totally normal. It's just a normal vibe. It's a great tool. Use it. You know what I mean? It's actually good to make your cameras perpendicular to the lines of the wall to purposefully make your shots feel normal. So, go ahead and aim for that if you're going for a normal vibe. So just to continue that normal vibe, again, perpendicular shots, but the camera's lowered here, a shoulder level shot. Just some more examples of straight on shots, but the camera at different heights. Okay. And we have your low angle shot and your high angle shot. So you probably heard this before, but a low angle shot can create that sense of dominance, of superiority, of power or grandeur in a character. And that high angle shot can create a sense of finitude or inferiority. Again, just some shots from the Matrix here. It's very clearly obvious what a high angle and a low angle shot does to the perception of a character. To get even higher, we can go to an aerial shot or straight down, or sometimes referred to as a God's eye shot, God's eye view. So that can give the sense that a character is ultimately limited. So that can be negative or positive. It could be that they feel trapped and they cannot get out of their environment. There's no way out. But it could also be looking up and, it could be an aspirational vibe. Oh, I'm here on Earth, but there's so much more out there and I'm ready to explore, for example. Then we have the Dutch angle or the tilted or skewed, whatever you want to call it. That can create a sense of unease, unsureness, anxiety. Let's move on to camera movement here. So what do we have available to us to move the camera around? What kind of camera movements can we do? So first movement is no movement. That would be the static shot. So what is the advantage of that? What is that used for? So what's cool about the static shot is it does not draw any awareness to the presence of the camera. It can help a viewer get immersed into the content actually by really removing any sense that there even is a camera. You can just forget that you're even watching a movie. So it's actually quite useful type of shot. It can also, communicate that sense of normalcy, stability. It can be used also to emphasize stillness or calmness, especially if you use it after a very highly intense scene or after a lot of movement. To come to that static shot really slows a film down. And we have handheld movement. So that really helps give a sense of realism, a sense of a documentary kind of vibe, a sense of presence, of aliveness to the moment. It can also give a sense of tension and intensity. It can be used that way, especially depending on the type of handheld work you're doing. Then we have your pan, which is the camera rotating left or right while maintaining in the same position. So that can be used as a transition. It can be used to reveal something, or it can just be used to follow the action, to follow a character around. And we have the tilt. Camera looks up or down while maintaining the same position, tilting up, tilting down, tilting up. And again, used in the same way, transition or a reveal or to follow the action. Then we have the push in. That's where the camera physically moves forward into the space. So that can bring us into a scene, or it can emphasize a dramatic moment, or it can direct our attention towards something. And then we have the pull out. The camera moves backwards away from the scene. So that can reveal context of the scene. You can reveal some other piece of information, or it can also give a sense of isolation to a character. So next is tracking movement. So that's where the camera is either in front of or behind the character, moving along at about the same pace that character is moving. And following that is trucking movement, which is very similar, but the camera's just moving alongside of the character, also at, relatively the same rate of speed. Then we have fluid movement, which can be alongside, it can be in front or behind. You see this a lot these days, especially now that, gimbals are a common thing, fluid movement. Then we have the boom up and boom down, which is raising or lowering a camera. And that can, again, reveal context, or you can follow action. Let's say someone's climbing a ladder, you're going up with them. And that can also be used in combination with tilting to change the power dynamic between characters. So let's say you bring the camera down and you tilt up at the same time. So you're changing your angle on the character in real time. So then we have a couple of camera movements which are a bit more like lens movements. First of all is racking focus. So that's just changing the focus setting mid-shot. So focusing from one thing and changing that focus to another thing. So next is zooming in and zooming out. You can also reveal context, reveal more of the environment, or you can draw your attention into some part of the frame. It's a bit less natural feeling than moving the camera into the space. It's a different vibe. And you have a dolly zoom, or otherwise known as the vertigo effect. So that's when you're zooming and doing a push or a pull at the same time. So what this effect is basically maintaining the subject at the same size, but what it does is it changes the relative size of the background and foreground in relation to that character. And then we have a camera roll, which is spinning the camera. And then we have a camera arc, which is moving a camera around a character in an arc. Okay, can give a sense of heroism, intensity, immersion, intimacy, even terror. So let's now move on to lighting. So lighting can affect our perception of a character's psychological state as well. Brighter scenes with softer shadows, for example, and lower contrast between the dark levels and the light levels, they can give a sense of levity and safety, normalcy, while darker scenes with higher contrast and harder shadows rather, can create a sense of moodiness, of drama and danger. Not always, but they're tools that you can use to push things in one direction or another. Let's first look at some general principles of lighting. So let's start with color temperature. So color temperature is a measurement of how warm, quote unquote, or how cool a light is, how orange it is or how blue it is. It's measured in kelvins. So the higher numbers, the higher temperatures equal a cooler or more blue light. The lower numbers equal a warmer light. So for example, a candle light might be around 1500 Kelvin, whereas daylight might be around 5600 Kelvin, for example. So what's going on here? Basically, every different type of light source has a certain temperature to it. For example, the sun is very cool. Or for example, that indoor, regular incandescent light bulb is very warm in color temperature. It's interesting because our eyes don't always perceive it, because our eyes are always naturally balancing out these color temperatures to make things generally look normal. But the camera is not always able to do that so well. So let's look at another principle, which is color reproduction fidelity of a light source. That's the ability of the light source to reveal the colors of an object faithfully. Certain light sources have more ability to have an ability to do this better than other types of sources. And then we have the intensity of the light as a general principle. So you can also use the differences in light intensity to draw your eye to particular parts of an image. So we look at this classic black and white image of the guy standing on the stairwell. He really stands out against that bright wall because he's pure silhouette. And also, I don't know if you can see it here, but he's holding on this tray a candle, which is brighter, more or less brighter than anything else in the image. So your eye will get drawn there. Let's talk about the direction of the light. This is very important in making people look good. So you can see here just an example of moving a light source around a subject and kind of the effects that it has on their face, how their bone structure might cast shadows in different ways. So it's an important thing to keep in mind. And it's something that is worth experimenting with and learning how and where to place light sources, thinking about how the shadows are going to be cast. The size of the light source is another principle of lighting. Smaller lights, that is, smaller light sources relative to the subject. So that can be the sun, for example. The sun is obviously huge, but relative to us, relative to a subject, it's actually quite small. It's quite a small source. It's a pinpoint source. So things like the sun, spotlights, flashlights, they will create sharper shadows. So let's compare that to larger sources relative to the subject. So a large source might be the sun on an overcast day when it's just super cloudy and there's light coming from everywhere. Or a large softbox, for example, a light through a big sheet. So that'll create softer shadows. On the left, you'll see the image here of a source of a small pinpoint light where the shadows are very sharp. And then you'll see on the right, that same pinpoint light through a big sheet of white fabric, creating a much larger source. It really softens up the shadows there. So what are some common light sources? The natural sunlight, of course, is a great one. It's extremely bright. It's about 5,600 Kelvin on that scale. And it has pretty much, quote unquote, perfect color reproduction fidelity. It's what all other light sources are getting compared to in terms of how well they can reproduce colors. Downside there is it's difficult to control. The sun's always moving. You don't know what the weather's going to be. Then we have tungsten or incandescent light sources. So you can find these types of bulbs in your traditional household light bulbs. And in many professional fixtures, they're about 3,200 Kelvin on the scale, so a lot warmer. And they also have very high color reproduction fidelity. And then the third most common light source, and probably the second most common nowadays over tungsten, would be LED. It's very power efficient. It's a lot cooler to the touch. The color temperature is variable, so you can change the color temperature, which is obviously extremely useful. And they have average to high color fidelity depending on the quality of the LED. Let's look at some types of fixtures. We have the sun again, so extremely high output. Obviously, it's really bright and it's a very small source, so the shadows are extremely sharp unless it's a cloudy day. You have your open face fixture, so that's just a bulb and a reflector. So that's also going to be very high output, but the shadow quality, the detail of those shadows is pretty poor. It has poor uniformity also. So some parts of that light are going to look brighter than other parts. Let's say you're just blasting it at a wall. Certain parts will be brighter than the others, and the shadows might not look so nice. They're not necessarily going to be sharp or clean. Then we have a Fresnel. So that basically is a lamp that contains a glass lens, and that allows the user to focus the beam from a pretty medium circle to a wider circle. And this has a lot better uniformity given the design of that lens on that glass. That means that the circle of light that it's projecting is pretty even in intensity all across the circle. And also using that lenses creates a lot cleaner and sharper shadows. Then we have the panel or soft light. So these are lights that just have a built-in diffusion panel. They have good uniformity and a lot softer shadows. Then we have a PAR, which stands for Parabolic Aluminized Reflector. You'll see these a lot in kind of cheap theater applications. They have a good quality shadow and pretty good uniformity. So it's that kind of middle ground. They're very inexpensive. They're similar to the open face, but that reflector is of a higher quality. And then we have LICOs. So these can focus light to a clean circle or other shapes even. That means that the projection of the lamp actually has quite a defined circular look to it, not just a soft circle, or it doesn't fade out at the edges, so it can have a hard circle like a spotlight. These also produce good quality shadows, and they also have good uniformity. Next type of fixture is a space light. So these are large fabric cylinders that basically you stick a lamp inside on the top and they spread light in all directions. That cylinder basically acts as a diffusion fabric just to spread light everywhere. If you just want to bring the whole level of a whole area to a bit more of a higher light level. China balls, they're similar to space lights, but in a ball shape. And then we have practical lights. So these are lights that are visible in the frame. So that's something that you would see in the movie itself. But they can be augmented to increase the output or limit the output. You can put different bulbs in them, change the color temperature, etc. So let's talk about light augmentation. What can we do to a light source? So first type of augmentation is no augmentation. So that's light just directly from the lamp onto the scene or onto the actor. That has the highest output. Obviously, it can look bad. It can look good. No augmentation in front of a Fresnel can look amazing. For example, it's been used for ages, especially big Fresnel lenses can look so nice, great looking shadows. Let's take a look at dimming. Dimming is helpful if it's impractical to move a source further away to reduce the output. It can also be a helpful tool when you're trying to balance the relative values of different light sources within a scene. And one interesting aspect of dimming is when it comes to tungsten bulbs, those incandescent bulbs, it will make the color temperature actually warmer, which can be a really nice effect. Okay, and then we have the concept of cutting light. So that's using materials to remove or reduce light from entering a scene or from reaching a subject. So we can see some great frames here of instances where directors of photography have used cutting very purposefully. So you can see here is just a small slit of light on James Bond's face to give him that really mysterious vibe. Also a frame from the TV show Severance, where you can see the director of photography using a bunch of slats of window light. What looks like is from the sun coming and striking that background there to really emphasize that theme of separation. Then we have the bounce. So that's using a material to bounce a light source into. And what this does, it increases the effective size of the light source. So you may have a small source. Once you bounce it into a big object, you got a bigger light source all of a sudden. What does that do? That reduces shadow sharpness and softens the light. You could also use a colored bounce if you want to add color, for example. So you can also use a material to bounce light off of without shining a fixture directly onto it. You can just collect some of that ambient light in the atmosphere and bounce it towards your subject. For example, this white card just catching that general sunlight and adding a little bit of light onto presumably someone's face here. You can also use what is called negative fill, which is essentially just a piece of black fabric or a black object or a dark object even to do the opposite of that. So if you place a big dark object near a subject's face, then the general ambience of light will get soaked up in there and it won't bounce onto your subject's face. And that will actually create a darker edge to them and increase the contrast on their face, which can be a very nice dramatic look. You can see they're doing this here in the interview setup on the right, adding a big piece of negative fill on the right to darken up that side of that subject's face. So let's look at silks and diffusion. So what are silks? What is diffusion? This is essentially translucent material that a source is shined through. So effectively increasing the size of a light source again to reduce shadow sharpness and soften up the shadows, soften up the light. So then we have glass and plastics. So you can get various effects by shining light through, different translucent objects. And then there's also just objects and obstructions to create various effects. You can see, light shining through this kind of cut piece of metal here. That can be used, especially when it's more out of focus than this image here. It can be used to kind of look like light's coming through trees or branches, other things like that. You can shine it through anything, get that effect. All right, let's take a look at some key terms here for techniques, lighting techniques. So we have ambient light. What does that mean? That just means existing light that's naturally found at a location. What's the ambient light level here? What's the natural light level? If I turned off this light that's in front of me, we could see the ambient light level of the room. Key light. That is the source that provides the majority of the illumination of a subject. So right now, this is this light right in front of my face right here. That would be the key light. It's providing the main source of illumination for my face. Fill light. That would be the light that is illuminating the shadow side of a character, that shadow that is being created actually by the key light. So that would be this side of my face. If I had a light here, that would be the fill light. I don't. Backlight, rim light, or edge light, these all essentially mean the same thing. That's a source that's coming from behind a subject to brighten the outline of the subject, to help separate them a little bit from the background visually. Then we have soft lighting. So that's the use of large sources to reduce the sharpness of those shadows. Hard lighting is the opposite. So then we have high key lighting. This technique, I guess you could call it, is using low differences in luminosity between the highlights and the shadows. So less contrast. Low key lighting would be a higher difference in luminosity between highlights and shadows. So maybe where I'm at now is somewhere in between. Then we have motivation. What does motivation mean in terms of lighting? That means using natural or what would be natural source of lighting as an influence or concept to shape additional lighting. So let's just say if this were a nighttime scene, if I had a lamp in the back on shining, let's say just a warm orange light, that lamp may not actually be reaching the back of my head, but I could add an additional fixture out of frame up above, shining a little bit of orange light onto the back of my head. And just by that lamp being there in the background and the light hitting my back of that light hitting the back of my head, you could say that that orange splash of light is motivated by the lamp. Let's move on. Silhouette. That's lighting the background but leaving the subject unlit. All right, some conventional concepts and techniques here. 3-point lighting. I mean, you can't get much more conventional than that. 3-point lighting, that basically serves to give a subject dimensionality and to set them apart from their background. So basically 3 light sources are needed. You need a key light, your main light on the subject. You need a fill light, which is a less intense light compared to the key light, and that's illuminating the shadow area of the face. And then you need a backlight, which adds a rim of light behind the subject to separate them from the background. So you see here, pretty classic example, 3-point lighting. You got your key, so that's soft, warm glow on the right side of his face. You have the fill light, which is in this case blue, and it's motivated by that swimming pool down there. And then you have your backlight, which is that white rim on the top of his head, which could be motivated by those little lights back there, but I don't know, stretching it. All right. Then we have natural lighting, quote unquote, natural lighting. So that's either really using natural light or mimicking the look of natural light or augmenting the look of natural light, basically to make the image appear as it does to the naked eye. So, oftentimes the way it looks in our eyes is not the way the camera perceives it. And if you want to make an image look natural, you might actually have to do a little more work to the scene to get it to appear the way it does to your eye. Let's just take, for example, this image on the top with all of these lamps in this image. In reality, if this was the natural scene, those lamps would probably not be at the level of light output that you see here in the frame to get it to look like this, even though our eyes might end up seeing it like that in reality. The filmmaker or the director of photography in this case might need to switch out all of those light bulbs to make them the appropriate level to match the ambient light level of the room. Similarly, the back window here in reality, if you were sitting in this scene, that, on camera, if nothing was done, that might be way too bright back there, kind of like what mine's going on right here. So in that case, the director of photography might add some filter over that glass or a net, some neutral density gel, for example, to bring down the level coming in from that window so you could see out of it without it being overexposed. But really, they're just going for a natural look. They're not trying to make it look stylized, for example, but it still takes a lot of work to get it there. Okay, so next technique we have is chiaroscuro. which is referring to the painting technique. How I like to look at it is basically the technique of starting with blackness in your image and painting light onto a scene, usually with these dark shadows and high contrast kind of look. All right, next we're going to get into operating a camera. We're going to get into the specifics of the gear and the settings. So basics here. These are the crucial things, how to expose an image, how to focus the camera, how to deal with depth, that Z-axis, and just basically trying to achieve the highest image quality that we can. So let's start off with exposing an image. This is the most important, fundamental skill that you need to know how to do when using a camera. So there are three main variables available to you to control the amount of light that gets recorded to get a good exposure. So you have the aperture, you have the shutter speed, and you have the ISO, which we talked about a little bit earlier, which is that sensitivity of the sensor, that amplitude setting. So first, aperture. What is an aperture? Aperture is the mechanism that reduces the amount of light that passes through the lens. So lower f-stop values equal a wider aperture and a brighter image. So we can look at this example image on the right here, f1.4, wide open, a lot of light coming through all the way down to f8, for example, pretty closed down, not so much light coming through, darker image. Why are the lower numbers wider and brighter? I like to think about the f-stop as a fraction, so 1 over 1.4 versus 1 over 1/8. 1 over 1/8 is a small value, so it's a small hole. 1 over 1/4 is a lot bigger, wider hole, brighter image. So that's how I like to think about it. Keeps it simple. So what are the creative opportunities with aperture? What can we do with the aperture? How does it affect the image artistically? When we set a lens to a wider aperture, say f1.4 or f1.2, we create more of a separation from a subject to the background or to other areas of the frame on the Z-axis. This is called creating a shallower depth of field versus stopping the lens down, stopping it down, basically closing that aperture to a smaller value, for example, f8, as you can see in the upper left here. More things become in focus relative to the subject or to the point of selected focus. So we're going to get into that a little bit later. What that's called is, again, the depth of field. So where you can affect the depth of field, basically, with the aperture while using the aperture. Let's talk about shutter speed. So the second main way to affect the amount of light, to affect the exposure of your image. So what is shutter speed? It's essentially the amount of time that the image is exposed to light. Basically, the more time that it's exposed to light, the brighter the image gets. So let's look at this candle down here, for example. And let's say that we're shooting at 30 frames per second. Okay, so we can see that a shutter speed of 1/30th of a second is a lot brighter when compared to a shutter speed of 1/250th of a second, for example. So 1/30th of a second is a lot more time than 1/250th of a second. And that gives the sensor more time to gather light. So those are shutter speeds down there. 1/30th of a second is a shutter speed. 1/60th of a second is a shutter speed. Now you'll notice that I didn't put 1/15th of a second, for example, or anything under 1/30th of a second. That's because we're shooting at 30 frames per second. If there are 30 frames per second, 30 successive images every second, the maximum amount of time you can expose one frame is 1/30th of a second. That's the lowest we can go on the shutter speed there. You can't go any slower than that. So that's just what that is, unless you're slowing down your frame rate. However, you can go quite a lot faster than 1/250th of a second, for example. So let's look just above those candle wicks there and look at these pie charts. So what are those referring to? This is another way to think about shutter speed. And if you remember back to the beginning of the video when we talked about traditional mechanical shutters on film cameras, this is what that's referring to. If we take a look at 180 degrees right now, this is the exact same design as that traditional film shutter mechanism on a film camera. So if we take our example of we're shooting at 30 frames per second. And we take this kind of theoretical spinning shutter that we have represented by this little pie chart at 180 degrees here. You can imagine one frame, only half of that time is that frame going to get exposed to the light. So what is half of that time? Half of 1/30th of a second is 1/60th of a second. So that would be our shutter speed there. So that's what that refers to. That's what that is hearkening back to, the times of film. So you can express shutter speed in terms of degrees, or you can express shutter speed in terms of fractions of a second. So both ways work. If you change your frames per second, your frame rate, you can keep that 180-degree shutter, for example, but your fraction is going to change. Let's just say we change to 24 frames a second, but we still want to use a 180-degree shutter. Well, that fraction will become 1/48th of a second, because 1/48th of a second is half of the time of 1/24th of a second, which is the time of one frame. So you can see how that works. So what are the creative opportunities with shutter speed that we have available to us? Well, we can go back to that 180-degree shutter as kind of a staple for a normal looking shutter speed. Why does it look normal? Why does it look natural? Well, part of it might have to do with the fact that we've seen movies for so long already shot like that, and we're completely used to it as a culture. But you can also do, the old wave your hand in front of your face trick and just see how much blur is actually there in your natural vision. And you'll see it actually pretty closely matches. It's about 1/48th of a second or 1/50th of a second, somewhere around there type of blur. So basically, the slower the shutter speed, the more motion blur you get. Okay. But faster shutter speeds, the less blur that you get. So this is super useful if you want to freeze motion. And you'll see this a lot in action sequences. It can give a feeling of kind of hyper awareness, hyper intensity. So basically every frame, the motion would be frozen in time, not blurred. It's going to have that kind of intense stuttering kind of feel, or hyper real feel, or that kind of intensity to it, versus a more normal look that has more motion blur, which is actually what we're more used to seeing with our natural eyes. So let's talk next about ISO. What is ISO? That's basically how much electrical amplitude is applied to the sensor, making it more or less sensitive to light. And what are the creative opportunities here? Well, the lower the ISO, generally is, that's going to be a darker image, not generally, for sure. The lower the ISO, the darker the image. The higher the ISO, the brighter the image is going to look. But what do you get with these things? With the lower ISO, you get less noise, you get less artifacts, basically up to the point that you hit the sensor's base ISO where it was designed. If you go below that, it may introduce some other effects. That's a more nuanced discussion, but generally, the lower you go with the ISO, the less noise you get. The higher you go with the ISO, generally, the more noise you get. It's gonna get noisy. It's gonna get you're gonna get those artifacts and stuff. Again, there's nuance to that. The camera might have a high setting, which is also a second quote unquote base ISO, where the sensor is designed to hit a certain amplitude, and then the noise will clean up again. It'll look good again, and then again, if you start going higher from there, it again gets noisy. So there's some nuances to that depending on the sensor you're using, but generally, higher ISO, more noise. Lower ISO, cleaner image. Let's move on to focusing. So this can be done manually for a natural feel. Films you see in the theaters, they're still done manually. And people have gotten really good at manual focusing. But obviously it can be aided by many different tools, or with cameras that are capable of autofocus like we have using right now. All right, let's talk a little bit about dealing with the Z-axis, the depth axis. So we're going to get back into depth of field this conversation. But first, let's start with the focal length of the lens. So what is the focal length? Focal length is basically measured in millimeters. Wider lenses have a lower millimeter, so 16 millimeter lens, 24 millimeter lens. These have wider fields of view, as you can see clearly in this image here. Longer lenses means a higher millimeter, longer lens, so that results in a tighter field of view. You're more zoomed in, so to speak. 135 millimeter lens, 200 millimeter lens. So what are the creative opportunities here? Besides zooming in, getting closer to something or looking further away, so to speak, at something. Let's get a little bit more detailed here. Wider lenses, they have a deeper depth of field. What does that mean? That means that more things are going to be in focus at the same time on the z-axis. The wider the lens you go, the more stuff is going to be in focus generally, between your subject and in front and behind them. Whereas longer lenses, they're going to have a shallower depth of field. Wider lenses, they're going to exaggerate the visible difference in distance between objects. Whereas the longer the lens, the tighter the lens, they will flatten the visible difference in distance between subjects. So it's easier just to look at what it's doing here than to explain it. You can see this woman here on the left shot with a wide angle lens, on the right shot with a longer lens. But you can see what's happening with this bridge in the background, how it appears to be way closer to her in the longer lens, and it appears to be way further away from her in the wider angle lens, yet she's still the same size in both frames. So with that shot on the left, the photographer's moving physically closer to her to keep her the same physical size in both of these images. Whereas in the image on the right, the photographer's having to walk much further away from her to keep her to be that same physical size in relation to the frame, right? But what's happening is that bridge is appearing closer or further away. So you're compressing the z-axis, or you're extending that z-axis to exaggerate the distance between objects. So this is an effect of using wider lenses versus lenses that are tighter. So let's talk about depth of field here. It basically has to do with how much is in focus in front and behind your chosen focus distance or your subject that you're focusing on. So if your shot has a narrow depth of field, that means basically only your subject is in focus and not much in front or behind them is in focus. If you have a large depth of field or a deep depth of field, then there's a lot of stuff in focus in front and behind your selected point of focus. So let's look at this practically here. So how do we affect depth of field? Like we said before, the focal length is one method to affect the depth of field. So longer lenses, like we were saying, 80, 135, 200, they have a shallower depth of field, as we can see here in this 100 millimeter lens. Again, what this photographer is doing is walking further away to make this girl appear to be about the same size in the frame. But it's, again, compressing that background, making him feel closer to her. But as we can see, he's more out of focus given this lens selection. Another way to affect it is by changing the lens aperture setting. So we talked about this just a little bit earlier, basically opening up the lens to that f1.4, f1.2, etc. That's going to result in a shallower depth of field versus closing down the lens, stopping it down to f11, f16, f8, like we were talking about earlier. You can see here f14, how much more that background here is coming into focus. And actually the foreground is also coming more into focus. There's just nothing there in the foreground for you to really notice that. So we're just noticing the background come more in and out of focus depending on the aperture setting here. Now, like we mentioned before, obviously with f8, or in this example, let's just take f14 versus f1.2, that's going to result in a much darker image. So you can see here on the subtleties of their settings, they're having to adjust the shutter speed and the ISO to different values to make the exposure remain the same, so that it's not getting darker, basically. So they're affecting other settings to keep those light levels the same, and we're just changing the aperture here so you can witness how that affects the depth of field by changing that aperture. Okay, next way to affect depth of field. This one's a bit simpler and sometimes not as obvious to people, but it's just the positioning of your subject relative to the background or other objects. So just getting your subject away from the background and moving them away from the background will make the background look more blurry. You don't have to have an expensive lens to do this. You can use the lens you already have now, and just walking with your subject at the same distance from the camera, but just walking together away from the background, all of a sudden, your background's going to become more blurry. How else can we affect the depth of field? Well, it's by changing your sensor size. Larger sensors will result in shallower depths of field perceptibly versus smaller sensor types. So why is this happening? Well, that's due to the requirements of the lenses that will work with these camera systems with different size sensors. So the larger sensor you have, the larger basically of an image circle you need to project onto that substrate to cover the entire sensor with an image. If you have a certain field of view that you want to achieve, let's just say this frame right here. If you make a smaller sensor, if we replace this camera with a smaller sensor, you're going to need a wider lens to get this same field of view. Why is that? Well, a smaller sensor would be cropping in essentially to this same image. So if we kept this same lens on a small, but put it onto a smaller sensor, all of a sudden we would be cropping into that image. So to compensate for that, you have to use a wider lens to get that same field of view. But what did we talk about just earlier? With wider lenses comes a deeper depth of field. Inversely, if you have a larger format camera, first of all, you're going to need a lens with a bigger image circle that it's projecting to be able to cover that format so that you're not creating a big vignette. But on top of that, if you have a bigger sensor, to get this same field of view, you're going to have to get a narrower lens, otherwise known as a longer lens. You're going to have to get a longer focal length. And what did we learn about before? With longer focal length lenses, the shallower the depth of field. So that's really just what's happening there. You're just basically using different types of lenses or at different focal length settings with different types of sensors. On the Super 16, they use a 25. On the Super 35, they're using a 50 millimeter lens, and on the full frame camera, they're using a 75 millimeter lens. But you'll notice all of the frames look essentially the same. And that's exactly the concept I was just talking about there. With those larger formats, you need longer lenses to achieve the same field of view versus the smaller format, the wider the lens you'll need to achieve that same field of view. So that's what's going on. That's why the sensor size also is a factor when it comes to affecting the depth of field. So when it comes to exposing the image, there are two generally kind of non-creative goals. One is to expose the face of a subject at a bright enough value to where we can perceive his or her facial expressions. So obviously there are artistic cases where you don't want to do that, but if we're just speaking super generally, you want to be able to see your subject, so we want to expose them with enough light. And then the second kind of goal, which can compete, with that is to maintain information in the highlights of your image and the shadow areas of your image simultaneously. So this is kind of another goal, which can always be a tricky thing to do, especially with cameras that don't have as much dynamic range as we talked about earlier. Having more dynamic range really helps a lot with that. So that's kind of, again, dealing with, do we have details in those highlights from this window? Probably not. This is probably blown out because I just put a little curtain in front of it. It's probably not enough to bring it down. It's like pretty much pure white. And we got pure black on this side, what to do, we're not using the highest quality of cameras, but we're doing what we can. A cinematographer often has to make that decision either to preserve the highlights or to preserve the shadows due to lack of dynamic range. This is something that's, been around since the dawn of filmmaking that we've had to deal with this. And we talked a little bit about ways to get about that, obviously augmenting your lighting, balancing your lighting. I could turn up this key light way brighter. Then I could expose a little bit lower on my camera, right? Close the aperture down, turn up the shutter speed, whatever I want to do, turn down the ISO, which would then bring down the level of that area outside. So balancing your light levels, or we could add some gel or more curtains in front of that to bring down that level. And I keep this light the same. So we're talking about balancing light levels. We're talking about crafting your image that way to maintain exposure that's not going off of the spectrum, either beyond 100% black or beyond 100% white. Keeping your levels in range. You can see this histogram on the right. This is basically a representation of the light values on a graph from the black levels all the way to the white levels, and where the information in a particular image might be falling. So this is an exposure tool actually that can be very useful to help you see where the light is in your image, how much of the light is in, how much of the information rather is in the shadows versus the highlights. And trying to keep that graph within those boundaries, so you don't see a big sharp line way off in the 100% white. That means you have something overexposed. Or if you have a huge amount in right down at the bottom of the left of your black areas, it means you have a lot underexposed. But again, it could be a creative choice. There are no rules to this game. You can do what you want, but just it's good to understand what you're doing. Generally, in the situation where you don't have enough dynamic range, it's a bit better to preserve the highlights and darkening the image a little bit, just because clipped highlights in this day and age still tend to look a little bit worse than crushed blacks. But that's changing with sensor technology. Digital cameras are getting better. They're tending to look better at blowing out the highlights. They're not as harsh as they used to be. So yeah, it's a game. Where do you want to play it? Just try and get it to look nice. There are a couple other tools that you can use to know that you're getting a good exposure. So one of them is the most basic one. That's just monitoring the image, using your eyes. Okay, so you can use the monitor on your camera, the screen basically, or you can use an external monitor, a bigger screen so it's easier to see, or you can use an EVF, which I like to do. Means, the electronic viewfinder you put your eye into, it darkens the whole outside world. You get a very clear view of your image. It's like you're in a small movie theater, and you can really see, okay, this is my image. This is what it looks like. I find that to be much more helpful oftentimes than a screen that you're looking at in broad daylight, and you might accidentally overexpose a little bit because it's bright out. But overall, this monitoring thing comes with practice, and it comes with knowing your monitor. So you have to be comfortable with the monitor, and you have to know kind of how every monitor is different. So the image that you get at the end of the day on your computer might end up looking a little bit different than it did on your monitor. And that's something that comes with practice and knowing your monitor and knowing your tool. So the second thing is you can use instruments. You can use aids. One thing is zebras, which you can see in this image here on the top. What zebras are, they overlay a black and white stripe basically to areas of the image that are overexposed. And you can set that in camera at what point you want the zebras to appear. So you can say, when I'm reaching like that 95%, it's about to be full white, then the zebras appear. So that'll give you a hint. Okay, these areas of my image are overexposed. I need whatever. It can be a visual aid to help you, especially maybe if you're using a monitor out in bright light and it's a small monitor. That can be pretty useful to turn that on and off and check what areas of your image might be overexposed. Another tool is using your camera's built-in light meter. A lot of cameras have them. They might be expressed in EV, exposure value, for example. It might just say you're over by +1 stop or +0.7, or you're underexposed by -2. That's usually measuring for basically 0, or good exposure would be 18% gray. So it's a bit arbitrary. You might be generally photographing something that's pretty dark, and you're going to want it to look darker, or you're photographing snow and you might want it to be +2 EV, because literally you're shooting things that are all white. So you don't want to just go off of that. You have to go also off of your eye and understand what you're shooting and what you should be shooting for. But that leads to a couple of other tools which are a bit more precise. False color. Basically, you can see here on this image on the right, what false color does is a method of representing the light values using different colors. So you see a lot of monitors come with this ability to show you false colors. And basically, each light value is ascribed a different color tone, and this can help you get an appropriate exposure for your skin tones, see if anything in the image is overexposed or underexposed. And fifth, the most accurate way to determine your light values is using a light meter, of course, a professional light meter, not inside of your camera, but it's its own device. You can go around your scene, you can check exactly what the light value is, and you can match your camera to that setting depending on how you want to expose the image. So that's going to be the most foolproof method for properly exposing images to the way that you want them to be exposed. So let's look at manual focus next. Let's look at focusing again, operating the camera. So again, we have some aids that we can use to get better focus, to get more accurate focus. Again, using a large monitor, pretty obvious, but having a bigger screen so you can see what you're doing more clearly. You can see more clearly what's in focus, what's out of focus. Very useful. Using follow focus gears. So instead of having your hand on the lens, you can put a gear on the lens or use a lens that comes with a gear already wrapped around it, and you can attach a big knob to the side. That gives you just finer control, a bigger gear to turn. You can get finer adjustments. A lot of these are wireless now, they have been for some time, but it's become cheaper even to have it wireless. So it's the same idea. You got a fine control. You're watching a big monitor. You can see what's going on. You have an intuitive feel of where the actor's moving. Et cetera, et cetera. Other tools would be peaking. So this is a visual aid that adds colored pixels to the areas of the image that are in focus. So that can help with pulling focus. And then magnification on your monitor. So that's just punching into view the image, closer up so you can see that fine detail. Is that really in focus? And then lastly, of course, is just actually measuring the distance from your camera sensor to your subject. So that's the most fail-safe way to get good focus. White balance. So we talked a little bit about white balance earlier, but that's something that you can also set in your camera. A lot of cameras, obviously, probably most of them have an auto white balance feature. A lot of them, I don't know, maybe the most professional end may not have that option. But basically, if you're not shooting in RAW, it's very important to set the color temperature of the camera. You're telling the camera what temperature is true white. So how do we do that? You can, again, use the monitor and use your eye. I actually like to do this a lot. If I know my monitor, I trust my monitor, I'll just pick a value that I feel is good, that looks right for the way I want it to look. You don't have to overthink it actually too much because it's a creative process. But if you want to get more exact with it, you can use the color temperature meter in your camera, point it at something, at a white card, and you can set it manually that way to give you an exact color temperature rating. You want to put that white card in the lighting condition that you're shooting in, obviously, so it's reflecting the light of your environment so that you're calibrating your camera to that temperature. There are also external color meters that can do this too. Yep. So those are different ways to set the color temperature. So you can set it to an exact Kelvin setting in your camera. Usually that's the most accurate way versus using any of the a lot of cameras come with presets, sunny, incandescent, light bulb, fluorescent. It's more, you can check and see if they look good, but it's simpler and often more accurate just to put in an exact Kelvin. Say, okay, 5600, I'm going to shoot this, or 5400, or you'll see what looks right. All right, and that pretty much wraps it up. I put a whole list here of the custom button settings I like to use on my A7S III. I don't know. I think A7S III is just such a good go-to camera. Obviously, we're probably about to move past this phase into the 4s, the 5s, the 6s, and some new generations of the FX series. And on it goes with Sony, on it goes with Panasonic, on it goes with Canon, on it goes with RE, on it goes with Blackmagic. We're nowhere near the end of this train of ever-evolving, beautiful camera systems. But I figured I would just put this here since I had already done it, a whole list of how I set up my custom buttons on my camera, what I find the most useful here, and same with my custom FN menu settings, what I like to quickly access all the time, how I set it up, and the descriptions of what all this does. You can see this again in the PDF that's attached down below. It's free. Feel free to download it. You can have the whole slideshow again there for free with more information than I have here, just showing you, because here I was just talking a lot of it out. I didn't put the full information on the slides visually. So if you want to go ahead and have that document for reference, you can download it. You feel free to share it with whoever you like. You can use it to teach other people. And I hope you really got something out of this course. I hope it was useful. All the timestamps should be below. So I'm just doing this all as one big old long video, so you can come back and refer to it if you ever need to. You can just jump to the timestamp that you need and get a refresher on anything. Hope it was helpful. Have a wonderful day. Goodbye.